Gite pairs of desperate eyes stared through the blizzard at the lone farmhouse, a beacon of potential salvation in a landscape determined to bury them alive. The oldest girl, Ruby May, her face gaunt but resolute, clutched a shivering 6-year-old to her chest, the child's frail body a stark reminder of the stakes. 7 other children huddled behind her, a frightened tableau against the swirling white, their ragged clothes offering little protection from the merciless cold. They'd been running for 3 days, their escape fueled by sheer will, the youngest ones teetering on the brink of collapse from hunger and exposure. Inside the weathered farmhouse, Thaddeus Mercer sat motionless at his kitchen table, the dim candlelight reflecting in the dust motes dancing above an untouched plate of beans. The 45-year-old farmer's calloused hands, worn smooth by years of toil, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His hollow eyes, deep-set and haunted, mirrored the flickering candlelight, revealing a man who'd surrendered to despair, clinging only to the barest thread of existence. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, a mournful symphony to his solitude. But Thad barely registered it anymore. Nothing much bothered him these days. The world had already taken everything of value. 2 years had passed since cholera swept through their small settlement like a scythe through wheat. 2 years since he'd buried his beloved wife Margaret, and their cherished twin boys, Samuel and Joshua, in the unforgiving frozen ground behind the house. 2 years of silent meals for one, of talking to ghosts that echoed in the empty rooms. He'd kept the farm running on autopilot, driven by habit, not hope. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed mending, the endless cycle of chores a shield against the torment of his own thoughts. A desperate attempt to keep his mind from drifting back to that agonizing week when fever stole everything that mattered. A sharp, insistent knock echoed through the silence, jolting him back to the present. Thad's head snapped up, his brow furrowing in confusion. Nobody traveled these parts after dark, least of all in a blizzard of this ferocity. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles east, and the town of Copper Ridge was a full day's ride south. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the wooden floor with a jarring sound, and moved toward the door with cautious, almost hesitant steps. Another knock, more urgent this time, resonated through the small house, followed by a voice, high-pitched and desperate, slicing through the howling wind. "Please, mister, we're freezing out here." Thad paused, his hand hovering over the door latch. The voice belonged to a young girl, barely more than a child herself, maybe 15 or 16 years old. A wave of memories, sharp and painful, washed over him, reminding him of Margaret. How she'd never turned away a soul in need, her compassion a constant flame in the darkness. But that was before the world turned to ash and left him with nothing but bitter memories and empty rooms. "We got little ones with us," the voice pleaded again, trembling with cold and palpable fear. "Please, sir, just for the night, we won't be any trouble." Through the small, frosted window beside the door, Thad caught a fleeting glimpse of movement in the swirling snow. Indistinct dark shapes huddled together, too many to accurately count in the blizzard's disorienting embrace. His hand remained frozen on the latch, a battle raging within him. Strangers meant complications, a disruption to the carefully constructed routine of his desolate existence. Strangers meant questions he didn't want to answer, conversations he didn't want to have, the potential for pain he couldn't bear to face. But little ones meant something else entirely, a painful reminder of what he'd lost, a tug on the dormant embers of his humanity. Against his better judgment, fueled by a flicker of empathy he thought had been extinguished long ago, Thad pulled the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his grip, a furious assault of icy air and stinging snow that whipped into his face like a physical blow. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat, a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over him. 8 children stood huddled on his porch, their ages ranging from a fragile-looking 6-year-old to perhaps 15. They were soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, and clinging to each other for warmth, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. The oldest girl, the one who had spoken, possessed fierce green eyes that burned with an inner strength that belied her youth. Tangled auburn hair, frozen in icy strands, framed a face etched with determination and weariness. She held the smallest child, a little girl who appeared unconscious from exhaustion, her head lolling against Ruby May's shoulder. "Thank God," Ruby May whispered, her lips tinged blue with cold. "Mister, we've been walking for days. The little ones, they can't go no further." Thad's eyes moved over the group, taking in the details that sent a chill down his spine. Torn clothes, bare feet wrapped in rags that offered scant protection from the frozen ground. The haunted, hollow look of hunger etched on their faces. These weren't ordinary travelers seeking temporary shelter. These were runaways, desperate fugitives, and from the haunted look in their eyes, they'd been running hard and fast from something unspeakably terrible. He should close the door. He should tell them to move along, to seek help elsewhere. Getting involved with runaway children would undoubtedly bring nothing but trouble. Questions from authorities, potential danger, and he'd already had enough trouble to last 10 lifetimes. But the smallest girl in Ruby May's arms, her face pale and fragile in the dim light, triggered a flood of painful memories, reminding him of someone else. Someone with dark curls and rosy cheeks who used to run to him in the dead of night, seeking comfort from the imaginary monsters that lurked in the shadows. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a searing reminder of his loss, and before he could fully process the consequences, before he could muster the strength to slam the door shut on their desperation, he stepped aside, his resolve crumbling like sand. "Get in here before you freeze to death," he said gruffly, the words sounding harsh even to his own ears, hating himself even as they left his mouth. As the children stumbled into his warm kitchen, bringing with them the scent of fear, desperation, and damp wool, Thad had no idea that opening his door, crossing that invisible threshold, would set in motion a chain of events that would either save him from his own despair or destroy him completely. Because what Ruby May hadn't told him yet, what she couldn't yet bring herself to articulate in the face of their immediate need for shelter, was why they were running, who was chasing them with relentless fury, and what those men would do to anyone who dared to offer them sanctuary. The children scattered around Thad's kitchen like frightened animals, seeking the warmth and safety of the stove, finally finding a momentary respite from the storm raging outside. Ruby May gently lowered the unconscious little girl onto the worn wooden bench near the stove, her movements careful and tender, while the others huddled close to the warmth, their shivering gradually subsiding. Thad watched them with growing unease, noting the details that twisted his stomach into knots, fresh bruises blooming on thin arms, angry red welts crisscrossing one boy's back, visible through the gaps in his torn shirt, the way they all flinched when he moved too quickly, their eyes darting nervously around the room. "What's your name, girl?" Thad asked Ruby May, his voice rougher than he intended, a lifetime of solitude hardening his tone. "Ruby May, sir. Ruby May Hollister." She kept her chin up, her gaze unwavering, despite her chattering teeth, a spark of defiance flickering in her green eyes. "This here's my sister, Daisy." She nodded toward the unconscious child on the bench. "And these are the others from where we came. And where exactly did you come from?" Thad moved to his pantry, his movements stiff and deliberate, pulling out what little food he had. Hard, dried biscuits, a meager portion of bacon, a jar of preserves Margaret had made before everything ended. The simple act of retrieving the jar a painful reminder of a life that was no more. Ruby May's eyes darted toward the door, then back to him, her anxiety palpable. "The Riverside Home for Foundlings, sir. 3 days' ride north of here." Thad's hand stilled on the jar of preserves, the glass cold against his skin. He'd heard whispers about that place in town, hushed rumors that painted a disturbing picture. An orphanage run by a man named Cornelius Wickham, who supposedly took in unwanted children and provided them with homes and education. But the whispers also spoke of children who mysteriously disappeared, of harsh, brutal discipline, of unspeakable things that made even the most hardened men look away when the subject was broached. "You ran away," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Ruby May's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on the floor. "We had to." The youngest boy, maybe 8 years old, his face pale and pinched with cold, suddenly spoke up, his voice trembling with fear and resentment. They was going to sell Daisy to that man with the gold teeth, said she was pretty enough to fetch a good price. Ruby May's face went white, her eyes widening in horror. "Hush, Tommy, don't—" "It's true," Tommy's voice cracked with emotion, his small body trembling. "And they was going to do worse to the older girls. Mrs. Wickham said Ruby May was getting too mouthy, that she needed to learn her place before—" "Hush!" Ruby May snapped, her voice laced with panic, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and not just from the cold. Thad felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest, a familiar darkness rising to the surface. He'd suspected abuse, a vague unease based on the rumors he'd heard, but this was something far worse, a chilling revelation that made his blood run cold. Human trafficking, child slavery, the kind of unspeakable evil that turned the world into a nightmare. "How long you been at that place?" he asked quietly, his voice dangerously low, the dormant embers of rage beginning to flicker within him. 2 years for most of us," Ruby May replied, her voice barely audible. "They took us from different towns when our families died or couldn't keep us no more. Said they'd give us good homes, but—" She trailed off, her voice choked with emotion. But Thad could fill in the blanks, the unspoken horrors painting a vivid picture in his mind. He'd seen enough of the world, witnessed enough cruelty and injustice to know how these stories ended. Orphans disappeared into the shadows of civilization, exploited and discarded by people who saw children as commodities, as objects to be used and abused, instead of human beings deserving of love and protection. "They're coming after you," he said, another statement, not a question, the realization sinking in with grim certainty. Ruby May nodded miserably, her shoulders slumping with resignation. "Mr. Wickham don't let his property just walk away. He's got men who track runaways, mean men with guns and dogs, men who don't care who they hurt to get what they want." She looked directly at him then, her green eyes, still fierce despite her fear, locking onto his. "You can't keep us, mister. They'll hurt you too if they find us here. Soon as the storm breaks, we'll move on." But even as she said it, even as she tried to maintain a semblance of control, little Daisy whimpered in her sleep, her face flushed with fever, and Tommy started coughing, a deep rattling cough that spoke of pneumonia taking root in his weakened lungs. The other children looked ready to collapse where they stood, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Thad stared at them, his mind racing, desperately searching for a solution. He should feed them, let them rest until the storm passed, then send them on their way with supplies and directions to the nearest town. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, the only logical course of action. But as he looked at Daisy's pale face, her shallow breaths barely visible in the dim light, and heard Tommy's worsening cough, he knew in his heart that these children wouldn't last another day in the wilderness. And if Wickham's men caught them? The distant sound of hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the storm, still distant but undeniably heading in their direction. Ruby May's head snapped toward the window, her face draining of all color, her eyes wide with terror. "They found us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The hoofbeats grew louder, cutting through the wind like thunder, a relentless pursuit closing in. Ruby May grabbed Daisy and pulled her toward the back of the kitchen, seeking any semblance of protection, while the other children pressed themselves against the walls, trying to disappear into the wood itself, their faces etched with abject fear. Their terror was so complete, so absolute, that it made Thad's chest tighten with a surge of protectiveness, a surge of rage he hadn't felt since he'd buried his family, a primal instinct to defend the innocent. "Get away from the windows," he ordered quietly, his voice surprisingly calm, moving to blow out the candles, plunging the room into near darkness. "All of you into the back room now. Stay quiet and don't make a sound." But Ruby May shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with desperation. "No, mister, you don't understand. If they find us here, they'll say you stole us. Mr. Wickham's got papers, legal documents that say we belong to him until we're 18. The law's on his side." "The law's got nothing to do with what I just heard," Thad replied grimly, his voice hard with resolve, checking the load in his old hunting rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon comforting in the face of the approaching threat. Selling children ain't legal anywhere, papers or no papers. You think that matters? Ruby May's voice cracked, her fear overriding her attempts at composure. Wickham's got judges in his pocket, sheriffs who look the other way. He's got money and connections, and we're just orphans. Nobody cares about... Through the darkened window, Thad could make out shapes moving in the snow. 3 riders, maybe 4, their silhouettes stark against the swirling white, sitting their horses with a confidence that spoke of experience. Like men who'd done this before, who were accustomed to getting what they wanted. They weren't rushing toward the house, their approach deliberate and unhurried, confident in their ability to handle one lone farmer and a handful of frightened children. "How'd you know about this place?" Thad asked, his voice barely a whisper, still watching the riders as they slowly circled his property. "Heard talk in town about a hermit farmer who minded his own business," Ruby May whispered, her voice trembling. "Figured you might not ask too many questions, might let us rest a night before moving on." The irony wasn't lost on Thad. The bitter truth that his carefully cultivated reputation for being unfriendly, for wanting to be left alone, had actually drawn these children to his door, placing them all in mortal danger. Margaret would have laughed at that, her infectious laughter echoing in his memory. She'd always said his gruff exterior hid a good heart, even when he tried his hardest to prove her wrong. His attempts at isolation a futile effort to protect himself from further pain. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the house, different from the children's desperate plea earlier. This was the knock of men who expected to be answered, who weren't asking for anything, but demanding it. "Open up!" The voice was deep, menacing, laced with an undercurrent of violence that sent a shiver down Thad's spine. "We're looking for some runaway children. Tracking them led us here." Thad looked at the 8 young faces staring at him with a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes, their futures hanging in the balance. He saw his own children, Samuel's insatiable curiosity, Joshua's mischievous grin, the way they'd looked at him with unwavering trust, like he could solve any problem, fight any monster that threatened them. But he also saw Margaret's disappointment, her silent disapproval if he turned these children over to men who would undoubtedly hurt them, exploit them, steal their innocence. She'd never forgiven cowardice, especially when it came to protecting the innocent, her moral compass unwavering. "You got proof these children are on my property?" Thad called through the door, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging within him, his hand firm on the stock of his rifle, a silent promise of resistance. A different voice answered, colder and more refined, sending a chill through the small house. "I am Silas Crane, representative of the Riverside Home for Foundlings. We have legal authority to recover our charges wherever they may be found. Open this door, or we'll be forced to search your property by other means." Ruby May's grip tightened on Daisy, her knuckles white. "That's him," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "That's Wickham's enforcer. He's the one who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the unspoken horror hanging heavy in the air, but the way she instinctively moved to shield the younger children, her body a fragile barrier against the approaching threat, told Thad everything he needed to know. "I don't see any children here," Thad replied loudly, projecting a false bravado, "and I don't recall inviting you onto my land." The silence that followed was thick with menace, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Then Crane spoke again, his voice laced with barely suppressed violence, a predator toying with its prey. "We tracked them to your door, farmer. Their footprints are still visible in your snow. You've got exactly 1 minute to produce them, or we'll come in and take them ourselves." Tommy started to wheeze harder, his cough echoing in the tense silence, a grim reminder of their vulnerability. One of the older boys, maybe 12, had tears streaming down his face, silently pleading for salvation as he stared at the door like it was the gates of hell itself. Thad found himself at a crossroads he'd never wanted to face, a moral dilemma with no easy answers. Turn over 8 terrified children to men who would undoubtedly hurt them, exploit them, and destroy their spirits, or make enemies of powerful people with money, connections, and the veneer of legal authority. Either choice would have devastating consequences, but only one would allow him to live with himself, to face Margaret's memory with a clear conscience. The problem was, he'd stopped caring about sleeping peacefully a long time ago, his own pain eclipsing everything else. 30 seconds, Farmer. Crane's voice had taken on an edge of anticipation, like he was actually relishing the prospect of confrontation, a sadist reveling in the power he held. Thad made his choice, his decision solidified by the desperation in the children's eyes, the silent plea for protection, the echo of Margaret's unwavering morality. He moved away from the door, away from the approaching threat, and toward the children huddled in his kitchen, his movements deliberate, his purpose clear. "Ruby May," he said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "Is there a back way out of that orphanage, somewhere they might not expect you to go?" Her eyes widened with a flicker of desperate hope, a spark of possibility igniting in the darkness. "There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles east of here. It connects to caves that run for miles underground, but mister, you can't—" "Time's up!" The door exploded inward as Crane's boot connected with the wood, splintering it into fragments, and 3 armed men burst into Thad's kitchen like wolves into a henhouse, their eyes scanning the room, their intentions clear. Silas Crane stepped through the shattered doorway like death itself had come calling, his presence radiating menace, his cold eyes devoid of any empathy. Tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to derive pleasure from other people's fear, he wore a long black coat that made him look more like an undertaker than a child recovery agent, a harbinger of doom. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking types with the kind of scars that came from violence, not honest work, their faces hardened by years of brutality. "Well, well," Crane said softly, his gaze slowly moving over the 8 children pressed against the kitchen walls, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "There they are, my lost little lambs." Thad kept his rifle trained on Crane's chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, though he knew the odds were stacked against him. 3 armed men against 1, with children caught in the crossfire. But something in Crane's smile, cold and predatory, the sheer arrogance of his presence, made Thad's decision even easier, solidifying his resolve. "These children are under my protection now," Thad said evenly, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. "You want them, you'll have to go through me." Crane actually laughed, a chilling sound like glass breaking, devoid of any humor. "Your protection, Farmer? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I represent legitimate business interests. These children are property of the Riverside home, legally bound to our care until they reach majority." "Property?" Thad's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Children ain't property." "Oh, but they are." Crane pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, unfolding it with a flourish. "Signed contracts, witnessed and notarized. Every one of these little ones agreed to indenture themselves to us in exchange for food, shelter, and education. Perfectly legal." Ruby May's voice shook with anger, her face flushed with indignation. "We never signed nothing. You forged those papers after you took us. Those are lies." "The word of criminals against legal documentation?" Crane shrugged, his eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "I wonder which a judge would believe. Besides, who's going to miss a few orphans?" One of Crane's men, a barrel-chested brute with missing teeth and a cruel sneer, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles menacingly. "Enough talking, Silas. Let's just take them and get out of this cold. I'm itching to teach the farmer a lesson." But Crane held up a hand, silencing his henchman, still studying Thad with those pale, calculating eyes, trying to unravel the mystery of his sudden defiance. "I'm curious about something, Farmer. What makes a man who spent 2 years avoiding human contact suddenly decide to play hero for a bunch of runaway orphans? It doesn't make sense unless you've got something to gain." The question hit Thad like a physical blow, the words echoing in the empty chambers of his heart. How did Crane know about his isolation, about the 2 years of self-imposed exile? A chilling realization dawned on him, a growing sense of dread that turned his blood to ice. Unless you've been watching me. All of this. Thad realized this wasn't chance, not a random encounter. You knew they'd come here. You planned this. Crane's smile widened, revealing a flash of predatory satisfaction. The grieving hermit with a soft spot for children? Oh yes, we've had our eye on you for some time. Grief makes people predictable, you see, and useful. We knew your past would drive you to act eventually. Ruby May's face went white, her eyes wide with horror as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. You led them here on purpose. You wanted us to find this place. You set us up. Sometimes the fox needs to think it's found the perfect hiding spot, Crane said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. Makes the hunt so much more satisfying. Thad felt the trap closing around him like iron jaws, the walls of his carefully constructed isolation crumbling around him. This whole thing had been orchestrated from the beginning, a carefully laid plan to exploit his grief, to use him as a pawn in their twisted game. But why? What did Crane gain from involving him in this elaborate scheme? Here's what's going to happen, Crane continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the ruthless pragmatism underneath. You're going to lower that rifle and step aside. We'll collect our property and be on our way. In exchange, we'll forget you were ever involved. We'll even leave you a little something for your troubles. Consider it compensation for your inconvenience. And if I refuse? Then you'll be charged with kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and interfering with legal recovery of indentured servants. Your farm will be seized to pay damages, and you'll spend the rest of your life in territorial prison. Not exactly a future you'd want for yourself, right? Crane's eyes glittered with malice, his voice dripping with menace. Of course, accidents do happen to men who make themselves too much trouble. The wilderness can be a cruel mistress to those who don't respect her. The threat hung in the air like poison, the message clear: cooperate, or suffer the consequences. Thad could see the fear etched on the children's faces, but he also saw something else, a spark of hope, a desperate longing for someone finally to stand up for them, to protect them from the horrors that awaited them. He looked at Ruby May, at the determination in her eyes, at the trust she had placed in him, and he knew what he had to do. He thought of Samuel and Joshua, and knew what was right and what was worth defending. You made one mistake, Crane, Thad said quietly, his finger tightening on the trigger, his voice resonating with a newfound resolve. Oh, and what's that? Crane asked with bored amusement. You assumed I still had something left to lose. The rifle shot echoed through the kitchen like thunder, shattering the silence and sending a jolt of adrenaline through everyone in the room. Silas Crane's look of smug confidence vanished forever, replaced by a stunned expression of disbelief as he slumped to the floor, his life extinguished in an instant. But as his body hit the floor with a sickening thud, the two remaining men drew their guns with deadly speed, their faces contorted with rage, and Thad realized his defiant act, his attempt to protect the children, might have just signed all their death warrants. The kitchen exploded into chaos as Crane's men opened fire, bullets ripping through the air, shattering dishes and splintering the walls. Thad dove behind his heavy wooden table, dragging Ruby May and little Daisy with him, as bullets whistled past their heads, narrowly missing them. The other children scattered like startled deer, seeking whatever meager cover they could find in the small room, their screams mingling with the deafening gunfire. Get to the back room, Thad shouted over the din, working the bolt on his rifle, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Run! The barrel-chested man was advancing toward them, his pistol smoking in his hand, his eyes fixed on Thad, his face contorted with rage. But he'd made a fatal mistake, focusing on Thad instead of watching his flanks, underestimating the resourcefulness of the children. 12-year-old Moses Cartwright, one of the older boys, his face grim with determination, had grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove, the same skillet Margaret used to bake bread, and brought it down on the man's skull with a sickening crack. The gunman dropped like a stone, unconscious but alive, the heavy skillet clattering to the floor beside him. But the third man, lean and quick as a snake, had already taken position by the door, cutting off their escape route, his eyes cold and calculating. His gaze swept the room, assessing the angles and cover, his movements fluid and precise. Professional, Thad thought grimly, recognizing the deadly efficiency of a seasoned killer. Enough, he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Drop the rifle, farmer, or I start shooting children and I won't hesitate. To To prove his point, he swung his gun toward 10-year-old Beth, who was pressed against the wall, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. His finger tightened on the trigger, a silent threat hanging in the air. Thad had no choice, his conscience screaming in protest, but knowing he couldn't risk the children's lives. He set his rifle on the floor and slowly stood up, his hands raised in surrender, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Smart man," the gunman said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Now we're going to walk out of here nice and easy, all of us. Back to the home, just like it should have been in the first place." But as he spoke, as the gunman's attention was momentarily diverted, Ruby May was already moving, her actions swift and decisive. She'd spotted something the gunman hadn't, a desperate opportunity that could change everything. Thad's hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light, lying on the kitchen counter just 3 feet away. With the desperate courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose, she lunged for it, her movements a blur of motion. The gunman spun toward her, startled by her sudden action, but Thad was already in motion, his reflexes honed by years of farm work, his body fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger. 2 years of grief and pent-up rage exploded out of him as he tackled the man, both of them crashing into the wall with bone-jarring force, sending the gunman sprawling. They fought like animals, rolling across the floor, each trying to gain control of the gun, their bodies a tangle of limbs and desperation. The weapon went off again, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling with a loud crack. Then again, shattering the window and letting in a blast of freezing air, further disrupting the already chaotic scene. Thad could feel his strength giving out, his aging body unable to keep up with the younger, more experienced fighter. He was a farmer, not a soldier, and grief had taken its toll, leaving him weakened and vulnerable. But then Ruby May was there, her face a mask of determination, the hunting knife flashing down in a swift, decisive arc. The gunman screamed in agony and released his grip on the pistol, clutching his wounded arm, blood spurting between his fingers. Thad grabbed the weapon and rolled away, gasping for breath, his body aching. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the wind howling through the broken window, a stark reminder of the storm raging outside. Then Tommy started coughing again, the sound wet and rattling in the sudden silence, a grim reminder of the danger they still faced. "We need to go," Ruby May said urgently, her voice low and intense. "Crane said he was watching you, which means he probably told others where he was going. More men will come looking when these don't return. We can't stay here. We have to leave now." Thad looked around his kitchen, his sanctuary for 2 years now reduced to a scene of carnage. Bullet holes peppering the walls, blood staining the floor, the door hanging off its hinges, a testament to the violence that had just transpired. There was no going back from this, no returning to his solitary existence. He'd killed a man, fought others, and made himself an enemy of people with resources and connections, people who wouldn't hesitate to exact their revenge. He was a wanted man now, a fugitive from the law, his life irrevocably changed. "The caves you mentioned," he said, his voice raspy, checking the loads in the captured pistol, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. "How far?" 5 miles east, but it's rough country in this weather," Ruby May replied, her face etched with concern. "And we got little ones who are already sick and weak. They won't make it." As if to emphasize her point, Daisy started crying, a weak mewling sound that spoke of fever and exhaustion, her body shaking with chills. Beth was shivering uncontrollably despite being near the stove, her teeth chattering, and Tommy's breathing was getting worse by the minute, his cough growing more labored. Thad made another impossible calculation, weighing the odds, knowing that every choice carried a risk of death. Stay here and fight whoever came next, probably dying in the process. A desperate last stand against overwhelming forces, or venture into a blizzard with 8 sick children, their chances of survival slim, their bodies already weakened by hunger and exposure, probably dying in the process. Either way, the odds were grim. But at least in the caves, they'd have a chance, a sliver of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. "Everybody grab whatever warm clothes you can find," he ordered, his voice firm and resolute, moving toward his bedroom to gather what supplies he could. "Food, blankets, anything that'll keep you alive. We leave in 5 minutes. no arguments. As the children scrambled to gather what they could, their movements frantic, Thad stared down at Crane's body, his face contorted in death, his pale eyes still open, still staring, but the arrogance, the cruelty, the power he wielded, all gone forever. In his coat pocket, the legal documents that supposedly made these children property, the instruments of their oppression, were already soaking up blood, a grim testament to the cost of freedom. Ruby May appeared beside him, her young face hardened by what she'd just witnessed, her eyes reflecting a newfound maturity. "You didn't have to do this for us," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Now you're a fugitive just like we are. Your life will never be the same." "Maybe," Thad replied, shrugging his rifle, his gaze fixed on the storm raging outside. "But at least I'm a fugitive who can sleep at night, knowing I did the right thing." Sometimes, outside, the storm was getting worse, the wind howling with increased fury, and somewhere in the darkness, more of Wickham's men were probably already riding toward the isolated farmhouse, their intentions undoubtedly violent. But as Thad looked at the 8 young faces depending on him for survival, their eyes filled with hope and trust, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 long years: purpose. He was no longer just a grieving widower, a man living in the shadow of his past, but a protector, a guardian, someone these children desperately needed. They had maybe 30 minutes before the next wave of hunters arrived, their arrival potentially sealing their fate, 8 lives hanging in the balance, and 5 miles of frozen hell between them and safety. What Thad didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have foreseen, was that their real troubles were just beginning, the dangers that lay ahead far more treacherous than they could ever imagine. The frozen wasteland beyond Thad's farmhouse stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, unforgiving expanse of white that seemed determined to swallow them whole. The wind cut through their borrowed coats like knives, their inadequate clothing offering little protection from the biting cold, and the snow was already knee-deep on the smaller children, making each step a monumental effort. Thad carried Daisy on his back, the little girl's body limp and unresponsive, while Ruby May helped Tommy, whose coughing had worsened, his breath rattling in his chest, his small frame barely able to keep pace. They'd been trudging through the blizzard for over an hour, their progress slow and arduous, when they heard it, a sound that sent a shiver of dread down their spines, the distant sound of hoofbeats and men's voices, growing closer by the minute, carried on the wind. "Down!" Thad hissed, his voice barely audible, pushing the children behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders, seeking whatever meager concealment they could find. "Nobody move, nobody breathe. We can't let them see us." Through the swirling snow, their vision obscured by the whiteout conditions, they could make out the shapes of at least 6 riders, their silhouettes stark against the landscape, moving in a search pattern across the terrain. These weren't the same men who'd come to the farmhouse. These were fresh hunters, experienced trackers, undoubtedly sent when Crane failed to report back, their presence a chilling reminder of the relentless pursuit they faced. "Spread out!" one of the riders shouted, his voice harsh and commanding, carried on the wind. "They can't have gotten far in this weather. They're probably exhausted and freezing. Find them!" Little Beth started to whimper from the cold, her small body trembling uncontrollably, and 13-year-old Marcus quickly put his hand over her mouth, silencing her, his own face twisted with fear. They all knew what would happen if they were caught now. After what had transpired at the farmhouse, the death of Crane and his men, there would be no mercy, no legal pretense, just swift retribution. Bullets in the back and shallow graves in the frozen ground. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, their proximity sending a wave of panic through the group, close enough that Thad could hear their horses breathing, the sound unnervingly close. One of them, a tall, imposing man with a jagged scar running down the side of his face, his eyes cold and calculating, pulled up near their boulder and studied the ground intently, his gaze sharp and discerning. "Got tracks here," he called out, his voice resin. The blizzard still raged, the wind a mournful cry in the desolate landscape, and the hunt was far from over. But in that moment, huddled behind the rocks, Thad knew one thing for certain. He was no longer alone. He had found a reason to fight. a cause worth risking everything for. And as long as those 8 young faces looked to him for hope, he would not falter. His farm would be a place of shelter and safety for these children at the very least, and he would defend them against the evil that sought to take them away. So there you have it, a story about finding hope in the darkest of times, about how even the most broken of us can rediscover our humanity and rise to protect the innocent. It reminds us that even a little bit of kindness can ignite into a powerful force for good. What did you think of Thad's transformation? What would you have done in his situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you have any questions or interpretations of the story, I would be happy to answer. And if you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey into the depths of the human spirit.